There's actually a Clovis burial site in Montana.
Two men were digging for rock in 1968 when their machine scraped against something red and brittle. They stopped, looked down, and saw bones coated in a strange blood-red powder. They had no idea they had just stumbled upon the Holy Grail of American archaeology. This wasn't just a burial, it was a message from the Ice Age. For 40 years, the message stayed silent. But when technology finally caught up, that silence broke. The DNA from this child proved a theory that many scientists had laughed at for years. And that is putting it lightly. The day the excavator hit history. In 1968, on a cold, crisp day in southern Montana, history was about to be made by accident. Two construction workers, Ben Hargis and Calvin Sarver, were working near a rocky outcrop on the Anzik family property. They were not looking for gold. They were not looking for dinosaur bones. They were just looking for fill dirt. But then their heavy equipment scraped against something that didn't feel like rock. It sounded different. When they climbed down to check, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. Spilling out of the earth were over 100 stone tools, looking brand new, and the fragile, fragmented bones of a child. But the weirdest part, everything was covered in a thick layer of brilliant red powder. So here is the deal. This wasn't just dirt, it was red ochre. Ochre is a type of iron ore that ancient cultures all over the world used for rituals. It symbolizes blood, life, and the earth itself. And whoever buried this child didn't just sprinkle a little bit on him, they dumped over 30 pounds of the stuff into the grave. This was a burial of immense importance. The child, who we now call Anzik I, was just a toddler, maybe a year and a half old. But the items buried with him were fit for a king. The workers found massive spear points, elk antler tools, and blades made from the finest stone available. These weren't just random rocks. These were Clovis points. Now, if you don't know what a Clovis point is, let me explain. In the world of archaeology, the Clovis point is like the iPhone of the Stone Age. It was a technological breakthrough. These spear tips have a special groove or flute down the center that made them easy to attach to a spear shaft. They were sharp, durable, and deadly. They were designed to take down the monsters of the Ice Age. We are talking about woolly mammoths, massive bison, and gomphotheres, which were like elephants but weirder. The craftsmanship on these tools was mind-blowing. Some of the pieces found in the grave were huge, way too big to be used for hunting. They were ceremonial. It shows that the people who buried this boy were not just struggling to survive. They had culture, they had art, and they had deep emotional grief. But here is the catch. For a long time, that is all we knew. We knew a boy died roughly 12,900 years ago. We knew his family was part of the Clovis culture, which many scientists believed were the very first people to set foot in North America. But we had no idea who they really were. Were they from Asia? Were they from Europe? The bones were taken out of the ground, and for a long time, they just sat there. Technology in the 1960s and 70s simply wasn't good enough to get deep answers. The skeleton was like a locked safe. We knew there was treasure inside, but we didn't have the key. And while those bones sat in storage, a war was raging outside. Scientists were fighting tooth and nail over where the first Americans came from. Some said they walked across a land bridge from Siberia. Others had wilder theories. Some even said they came from France across the frozen Atlantic Ocean. It was a mess. Everyone had a theory, but nobody had proof. The Anzik child was watching it all from his box, waiting. He held the answer in every cell of his body, but unlocking it would require destroying a part of him. And that brings us to the most controversial part of the story. Because to find the truth, scientists had to do something that would upset a lot of people. The silence of the bones was about to be broken forever. The science that shattered the myths. Before we get to the results, you have to understand why this was such a big deal. For decades, American archaeology was dominated by one rule, the Clovis first dogma. Basically, the idea was that about 13,000 years ago, a group of hunters with those fancy spear points crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia, walked down a corridor between the ice sheets, and populated the Americas. It was a neat, clean story, but then people started finding things that didn't fit. They found sites in Chile that looked older than the sites in Alaska. They found skulls that didn't look like modern Native Americans. And then came the Solotrian hypothesis. This is where things get crazy. Some researchers looked at those beautiful stone tools found with the Anzic child and said, hey, these look a lot like the tools made by the Solutrean people in France. They proposed that the first Americans didn't walk from Asia. They paddled along the ice edge from Europe. This idea was massive. It suggested that Native Americans might not be the first ones here, or that they mixed with ancient Europeans. It was a theory that sparked intense debates and even political arguments. The identity of the first Americans was up for grabs. Enter Eske Willerslev. He is a famous geneticist from Denmark who specializes in ancient DNA. He is basically a detective who solves cold cases that are thousands of years old. He knew that the Anzic child was the key. If he could map the boy's genome, he could see exactly who his ancestors were. But it is not that simple, though. Getting DNA out of a skeleton that has been in the ground for 12,000 years is a nightmare. The DNA degrades. It breaks into tiny microscopic pieces. And the worst part? Contamination. Every person who had touched those bones since 1968, the construction workers, the museum curators, the visitors, left their own DNA on them. So when you try to sequence it, you might be sequencing the guy who packed the box in 1980 instead of the ancient child. Willerslev and his team had to use brand new cutting-edge methods to clean the samples and isolate the ancient code. They took tiny fragments of the skull and rib. They worked in sterile rooms that looked like spaceships to make sure no modern dust got in. It was a high-stakes gamble. They were destroying a tiny bit of the skeleton to save the history. If they failed, they would have damaged a sacred artifact for nothing. But if they succeeded, they would have a map of the ancient world. The results came back, and they were shocking. The first thing they looked for was that European connection. If the Solutrean hypothesis was right, this boy should have markers from ancient France or Spain. Everyone was holding their breath. The computer crunched the data, and the answer was a definitive, hard no. There was zero European DNA in the Anzic child. The Solutrean hypothesis was dead in the water, but what they found instead was even more incredible. The boy's DNA showed he was directly related to an ancient population from Siberia. This proved the Bering land bridge theory was correct. His ancestors had walked from Asia. But here's where it gets really interesting. They compared his DNA to other ancient skeletons from around the world. He wasn't just a wanderer, he belonged to a very specific group that had been isolated for a long time. The data suggested that his ancestors left Asia, but they didn't just keep walking, they stopped. For maybe thousands of years, they lived in a land that no longer exists called Beringia. It is the land that is now underwater between Russia and Alaska. During that time, isolated from the rest of the world, their DNA changed. They became a distinct people. They became the first Americans. And when the ice finally melted enough to let them through, they didn't just trickle in. They exploded onto the continent. The Anzic child was part of that wave. He was the son of those pioneers. But the scientists weren't done. They decided to compare his DNA to living people today. And this is the part that made headlines around the world. This is the part that gave me goosebumps. The boy was not just a relic, he was a grandfather. Mapping the blood of a continent. So here is the deal. The team took the Anzic child's genetic code and compared it to the DNA of dozens of different indigenous tribes from North, Central, and South America. They wanted to see if anyone alive today was related to this little boy. The results were staggering. The Anzic child is more closely related to Native Americans than he is to any other human population on Earth. But it goes deeper than that. They found that about 80% of all Native Americans represented in the study, from the distinct tribes in Canada all the way down to the Mayan people in Mexico and the Mapuche in Chile, share a direct genetic lineage with this child's family. Think about what that means. This one toddler buried under red dust in Montana represents the founding population for an entire hemisphere. He is like a genetic reference point. The data showed that the Native American population split into two main groups very early on. One group stayed up north, becoming the ancestors of the Athabascan-speaking peoples. The other group, the one Anzic belonged to, moved south, and they moved fast. This is the wow factor that blew scientists away. For a long time, we thought people moved slowly, taking thousands of years to get from Alaska to South America. But the DNA says otherwise. The fact that the Anzac Child in Montana is so closely related to ancient skeletons found in South America proves that the migration was a sprint. Once they crossed that ice barrier, these people spread out like wildfire. We are talking about humans adapting to totally different environments, from frozen tundra to deep jungles to high mountains in just a few thousand years. They were the greatest explorers in human history. They didn't have maps. They didn't have GPS. They just had grit, family, and those deadly Clovis points. This discovery also solved the mystery of the different-looking skulls. Scientists used to think that because some ancient skulls look different, they must be different races of people. But the genetics proved that is just natural variation within one family. It is like how you might not look exactly like your cousin, but you are still related. The Anzac Child proved that all these diverse tribes and nations, despite their different languages and cultures today, share a common root. They are all branches of the same tree, but there is a darker side to this story. For a long time, Western science treated Native American bones as specimens, not people. Museums were full of skeletons that were taken without permission. The Anzac Child was found on private land, so technically he belonged to the landowners. But ethically, that is a different story. When the scientists realized how closely related this boy was to modern tribes in Montana, like the Crow and the Cheyenne, they realized they couldn't just treat him like a lab rat. They had a moral obligation. The tribes had been saying for centuries that they had been here since the beginning. They said their ancestors came from the earth or were brought here by the Creator. Science had always dismissed those stories as myths, but now the science was backing them up. The DNA proved deep ancient continuity. This child was one of them, and that meant he deserved to be treated like one of them. The scientists did something that rarely happens. They went to the tribes, they explained the results. They showed them that this boy was their ancient uncle. And then they asked, what should we do with him? The answer was clear. He needed to go home. He had been in a box, poked and prodded for 46 years. It was time for him to rest. Science was done. Now it was time for the spirit. On June 28, 2014, a ceremony took place that changed the relationship between scientists and indigenous people forever. It was a hot summer day in Montana. Representatives from several tribes gathered near the site where the boy was found. They weren't there to protest. They were there to welcome a relative home. The scientists brought the remains. The Anzac family, who had respected the bones and kept them safe for so long, was there too. So, do you think we should continue digging up ancient graves to learn our history, or should we leave the dead in peace? It is a tough call. Let me know your stance in the comments below. If you learned something new, smash that like button and subscribe.